My husband had strictly forbidden me from ever visiting his old farm. He called it a toxic money pit. But just days after he died in a sudden car crash, his estate lawyer handed me a rusted key and said those acres now belonged solely to me. I planned to sell the wasteland immediately to clear my head, but my forensic instincts demanded I inspect the property first. When I forced the heavy barn doors open, the freezing air hit my face, and I could not breathe because what I found humming inside changed absolutely everything. I am Natalie, 33 years old, and until last week, my in-laws thought I was nothing but a fragile middle-class bean counter they could easily crush. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family member who severely underestimated your intelligence. The damp earth was still falling onto Liam's casket when my mother-in-law, Patricia, made her move. The heavy Seattle rain soaked through my black morning dress, but Patricia stood perfectly dry under an oversized golf umbrella held by her shivering assistant. Without a single word of comfort, without shedding one genuine tear for her eldest son, she marched directly up to me and hurled a cheap plastic trash bag hard against my chest. I caught it instinctively, the crinkling plastic loud over the somber sound of the rain. "You have exactly 24 hours to clear your cheap clothes out of my son's bay house," Patricia announced, her voice carrying easily over the heads of the lingering funeral guests. Her perfectly manicured finger pointed sharply at my face. "I have already listed the property with my broker. My son is dead and you no longer have any right to leech off this family's wealth." I stood perfectly still, my analytical mind processing her aggressive posture and the calculating glint in her eyes. I did not cry. I had done my crying in private, away from the predatory gaze of Liam's relatives. Instead, I calmly lowered the trash bag to the wet grass at my feet. Before I could speak, my sister-in-law Brittany stepped out from beneath her mother's umbrella. She was wearing a designer black dress that looked more appropriate for a cocktail party than a funeral. Her eyes immediately dropped to my left hand. "Actually, while you are packing your discount rack wardrobe, hand over that wedding ring," Brittany smirked, extending her open palm toward me. A glorified bean counter could never afford those diamonds anyway. Liam clearly bought that ring with mother's money, and we want it back in the family vault where it belongs. Her husband DeAndre, a talented architectural engineer and a proud African-American man who usually kept the peace, visibly stiffened at his wife's cruelty. He stepped forward silently and positioned his own umbrella to shield me from the downpour, offering a quiet gesture of solidarity. Brittany shot him a venomous glare, but he held his ground. Their utter lack of humanity did not shock me. For the 3 years I was married to Liam, Patricia and Brittany had missed no opportunity to remind me of my modest background. They assumed my career as a forensic auditor meant I sat in a dreary cubicle pushing papers. Liam, a brilliant systems architect, had always protected me from their venom, deliberately keeping our finances entirely separate from Patricia's greedy reach. Now that he was gone, they assumed I was an easy target. They assumed incorrectly. I looked at Brittany's extended hand, noting the slight tremor of her fingers. I knew for a fact she had been living far beyond her means. Financial desperation always breeds audacity. I calmly reached into my leather tote bag. I did not pull out my ring. Instead, I retrieved a folded, officially stamped document I had anticipated needing today. I unfolded the paper and held it up just high enough for Patricia to read the bold print at the very top. "The Bay House is in my name, Patricia," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "I bought that property outright with the money from my first auditing firm long before I ever met your son. It is solely my asset. Step one single foot on my property, and I will gladly ensure you serve 5 years in federal prison for trespassing and breaking and entering." Patricia's face drained of color. Her eyes darted from the property tax receipt to my face, searching for any sign of bluffing. Finding none, her shock quickly morphed into a furious scowl. Before she could launch another verbal assault, Mr. Caldwell, Liam's longtime estate lawyer, approached us. He politely but firmly guided me away from the screaming in-laws and toward the privacy of his parked town car. I turned my back on Patricia and her empty threats, letting the heavy Seattle rain wash over my black morning coat. Mr. Caldwell Liam's longtime estate lawyer placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. He guided me away from the manicured grass of the cemetery and toward his idling town car, parked on the gravel shoulder. The heavy thud of the car door closing finally blocked out the sound of Brittany complaining loudly about the mud ruining her designer heels. Mr. Caldwell let out a long breath and wiped the condensation from his wire-rimmed glasses. He did not offer empty condolences or patronizing words about time healing all wounds. He knew I operated on logic rather than platitudes. I was a woman who lived by spreadsheets, audit trails, and empirical evidence. Grief was a variable I had not yet learned to calculate. Instead of speaking, he reached into his tailored breast pocket and pulled out a heavy rusted iron key. He pressed it directly into my palm. The metal felt ice cold against my skin. "Pine Ridge Farm," he said quietly, his voice lacking its usual legal detachment. "Liam left it to you. Sole ownership. No trusts, no family provisions, no contested probate. It is entirely yours." I stared at the jagged, oxidized teeth of the key. My chest tightened, not with fresh grief, but with sheer professional confusion. Pine Ridge Farm was the one strict boundary in our entire marriage. Liam had expressly forbidden me from ever driving out to that property. He always told me it was a toxic, debt-ridden mud pit left over from a failed agricultural venture in his 20s. He swore the soil was contaminated, the foundation of the old barn was rotting, and the liabilities attached to it would ruin my immaculate credit score if my name was ever associated with it. He told me he was actively trying to let the bank foreclose on it just to wash his hands of the nightmare. Why would a man who spent his life shielding me from his family's financial chaos suddenly bequeath me a literal toxic asset? As a forensic auditor, my entire career was built on identifying corporate liabilities and neutralizing them before they destroyed a ledger. Liam knew I would hate this. He knew I would try to liquidate it immediately to balance the books. Yet here was his trusted lawyer handing me the physical key instead of a simple deed of sale. It made zero logical sense. Before I could demand that Mr. Caldwell explain this discrepancy, the passenger door was violently yanked open from the outside. The freezing wind howled into the quiet cabin, bringing Patricia with it. She leaned her upper body into the car, her expensive black mourning veil dripping water onto the pristine upholstery. Her eyes instantly locked onto the rusted iron resting in my open hand. I saw a flash of raw, unfiltered panic cross her expression, followed immediately by calculated predatory greed. She practically salivated looking at that piece of junk metal. "I will buy that toxic wasteland from you right now," Patricia demanded, her voice shrill and urgent, completely dropping the grieving mother act she had been performing for the funeral guests just moments prior. $50,000. Cash. It will cover my son's funeral debts that we both know you cannot afford since your accounts are currently tied up in probate. My thumb brushed over the rough edge of the key. I am a woman who dissects corporate fraud for a living. I read people through their financial desperation, observing the microscopic tells when someone is lying about money. Patricia was a status-obsessed narcissist who would not spend $50 on a pair of shoes that did not have a recognized designer label. She despised rural areas and complained when dirt touched her suburban driveway. Why was she offering $50,000 in liquid cash for a contaminated mud pit on the absolute worst day of her life? The math was fundamentally wrong. The behavior deviated completely from her established psychological baseline. A true distressed asset buyer negotiates. They point out the flaws, they offer a low value, and they walk away to make you sweat. Patricia opened with a premium cash offer on a property she supposedly loathed. In the auditing world, we call this a preemptive strike to bury evidence. The manufactured urgency was a massive, glaring red flag. I looked at her manicured hand gripping the leather interior of the town car, her knuckles white with tension. She was desperate. She was terrified of me holding this key. Brittany peered over her mother's shoulder, her eyes wide with a similar manic urgency. "Take the money, Natalie," Brittany snapped, shivering in the rain. You are practically bankrupt without Liam paying your bills. Mom is doing you a massive favor by taking that toxic dump off your hands. I closed my fist around the key and slipped it deep into my coat pocket. No deal, I said, my voice eerily calm and steady. Patricia's eyes widened in genuine shock. What do you mean, no deal? You have no money, Natalie. You cannot even afford the property taxes on that dirt. It is a liability. I am offering you a lifeline. Then I suppose the county will seize it, I replied, staring her dead in the eye and refusing to break contact. But until they do, the property belongs to me. And I do not sell undocumented assets without a thorough independent appraisal. Patricia slammed her hand against the roof of the car. You are making a massive mistake. I am trying to help you. I am trying to clean up my son's mess before it drags this entire family's good name through the mud. You have never cleaned up a mess in your life unless there was a massive payout waiting underneath it. I shot back, my tone dropping to a dangerous register. Close the door, Patricia. The rain is ruining Mr. Caldwell's leather seats. She hissed a sharp breath through her teeth, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. I will freeze every single asset he ever touched, she threatened, her voice dropping to a vicious, trembling whisper. I have the best probate lawyers in the state. I will tie you up in litigation and starve you out until you come crawling to me on your knees, begging me to buy that land. She slammed the door shut with tremendous force, leaving the car rocking violently on its suspension. I watched through the rain-streaked window as she stomped away, barking orders at Brittany, who scrambled to follow her. I turned to Mr. Caldwell. He slowly put the car in drive, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, his eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror. He looked absolutely terrified of what Patricia might do next. I pulled out my phone and typed the rural address for Pine Ridge Farm into the navigation application. I was not going back to my empty house to mourn. I was going to find out exactly what my husband had hidden in the mud and why his mother was willing to drop $50,000 in cash to keep me away from it. I thanked Mr. Caldwell for his discretion, pushed open the heavy door of his town car, and stepped back out into the freezing Seattle downpour to walk to my own vehicle. I had barely made it 3 steps across the flooded cemetery grass before Brittany intentionally blocked my path. She shoved her smartphone mere inches from my face, the bright screen glaring against the gloomy gray sky. She wore a smug, self-satisfied grin that looked entirely out of place at her own brother's burial. Check your banking app, Natalie, Brittany sneered, her voice dripping with venom. Mom was not bluffing about starving you out. I just got off the phone with the estate branch manager at Northeast Mutual. I filed a formal notice of a probate dispute on behalf of the family. They froze Liam's primary checking and savings accounts 10 minutes ago. You cannot access a single cent. The freezing rain battered my shoulders, soaking through my thin black coat. Before I could formulate a response to her financial ambush, a large black umbrella suddenly appeared over my head, instantly shielding me from the relentless downpour. I turned my head and saw DeAndre Brittany's husband standing firmly beside me. He held the umbrella steady over me, his broad shoulders squared completely, ignoring his wife's malicious display. Patricia, who had been waiting near their luxury sport utility vehicle, shot DeAndre a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. It was the same sharp, racially charged glare she weaponized whenever he dared to step out of the subservient background role she demanded of him. Patricia had always treated him like an inconvenient accessory rather than a son-in-law, constantly dropping subtle insults about his background and his career as an architectural engineer. DeAndre did not flinch under her toxic stare. His jaw tightened, but he kept the umbrella firmly positioned over my head, protecting me from the storm. In all the years I had known him, he rarely spoke against the family, choosing instead to endure their endless microaggressions, simply to keep the peace for his young son. But this silent public act of defiance spoke volumes. He was drawing a clear line in the mud, and he was standing on my side of it. Brittany scoffed loudly, clearly irritated that her own husband was ruining her power trip. You are going to lose everything, Natalie, she spat, her face twisting into an ugly scowl. You cannot even afford the gas to drive back to that cheap middle-class condo you came from. Give us the key to the farm, and Mom will make this easy for you. Refuse, and we will drag you through court until you are homeless." I did not give her the satisfaction of a verbal reaction. I simply gave DeAndre a silent nod of profound gratitude, stepped out from under the safety of his umbrella, and climbed into my car. I locked the doors, connected my phone to the dashboard, and pulled up the GPS coordinates for Pine Ridge Farm. Liam had spent our entire 3-year marriage making me promise to never visit that specific property. He told me it was a hazard, a massive regret, a place best forgotten entirely. He said the soil was ruined, the structures were collapsing, and it was nothing but a black hole for property taxes. But as I threw my car into drive and accelerated past Patricia and Brittany scattering wet gravel against their designer boots, I knew with absolute certainty that Liam had lied to me. I had to know exactly why. The drive took nearly an hour, taking me far outside the city limits and winding deep into the dense rain-soaked pine forests of the Pacific Northwest. The smooth paved highway eventually gave way to a deeply rutted, unmaintained dirt road. I navigated the treacherous mud carefully, my tires spinning and slipping before finally gaining traction on the steep incline. The trees grew thicker here, their heavy branches blocking out the remaining afternoon light, casting the road in deep, eerie shadows. Finally, I pulled up to a set of towering, rusted iron gates that were chained and padlocked shut. I put the car in park, leaving the engine running and the headlights cutting through the heavy fog. I stepped out into the biting cold air. Beyond the forbidding iron gates stood Pine Ridge Farm. From a distance, it looked exactly as Liam had described it. It was a decaying, forgotten nightmare. The main barn sagged heavily to one side, its wooden planks blackened with severe rot and slick with green moss. The roof was missing several large corrugated metal sheets, leaving the dark interior completely exposed to the harsh elements. Tall dead weeds choked the perimeter, and a rusted tractor sat abandoned in the front yard, consumed by creeping vines. It looked like a stiff wind could collapse the entire structure into a pile of worthless, splintered wood. It was the absolute picture of rural poverty and failure. I pulled the heavy iron key Mr. Caldwell had given me from my coat pocket. It felt dense and cold against my palm. As I approached the rusted padlock on the main gate, my boot crunched loudly against the wet gravel, but the sound was immediately swallowed by something else entirely. I stopped walking. I stopped breathing. I tilted my head, listening intently to the surrounding air. It was not the howling wind rushing through the pine trees. It was not the heavy rain hitting the muddy earth. It was a distinct mechanical vibration. A massive, heavy, rhythmic hum was resonating straight up through the mud and vibrating against the soles of my shoes. It was a low-frequency drone, powerful and relentless, pulsing with immense electrical energy. My forensic auditing background had taken me through dozens of corporate facilities and industrial zones. I recognized that specific sound immediately. It was the undeniable, unmistakable noise of industrial-grade turbine cooling fans and massive server racks operating at maximum capacity, buried somewhere deep beneath the rotting wooden floorboards of the abandoned barn. The rusted iron key slid into the heavy padlock securing the barn's main double doors. With a harsh metallic grind, the lock gave way. I pulled the heavy wooden doors apart, stepping into the dim, musty interior. The air smelled of damp earth and rotting timber, exactly what you would expect from an abandoned agricultural property in the Pacific Northwest. Dust motes danced in the pale light filtering through gaps in the collapsed roof. I walked past rusted plows and empty feed troughs, my heels sinking slightly into the dirt floor. My analytical mind kept searching for the source of the low-frequency hum I had heard outside. It was louder in here, a steady vibration pulsing against my collarbone. I moved toward the back of the barn, where a massive pile of stacked hay bales seemed deliberately placed. Pulling one aside, then another, my hands brushed against something completely out of place in a dilapidated barn. Cold, smooth metal. I cleared the remaining hay, revealing a massive reinforced steel vault door seamlessly integrated into the barn's original stone foundation. It looked like the entrance to a bank's subterranean safe. In the center of the steel plate sat a digital keypad glowing with a faint blue light. Liam had not left me a toxic liability. He had left me a fortress. My fingers hovered over the keypad. I did not need to guess. Liam operated on absolute logic, but his core passwords always revolved around the one variable he could never completely quantify. I typed in the 6 digits of our wedding anniversary. The keypad chimed a single sharp note. A heavy pneumatic hiss echoed through the empty barn, followed by the heavy clanking of internal locking bolts retracting. I grabbed the thick steel handle and pulled the heavy door open. A violent blast of freezing hyper-conditioned air hit my face, instantly drying the rain on my skin. I stepped over the threshold, and the world transformed. Gone was the rotting wood and damp earth. I stood on a raised, anti-static flooring grid inside a pristine, brilliantly lit, temperature-controlled corridor. Before me stretched rows upon rows of towering black server racks. Thousands of LED indicators blinked in rapid synchronized green and blue rhythms. The deafening hum of industrial cooling units filled the cavernous subterranean room. This was not a hobbyist basement setup. This was a state-of-the-art, multi-million-dollar encrypted data center. Liam had always downplayed his career, calling himself a simple systems architect who managed basic network logistics for mid-sized firms. Looking at the sheer scale of this infrastructure, I realized my quiet, unassuming husband was secretly hosting top-tier, highly classified data streams. He had built an empire right beneath the mud. I walked down the central aisle, my mind rapidly calculating the raw value of the hardware alone. We were looking at tens of millions in server technology. At the far end of the room sat a minimalist glass desk with a dual-monitor workstation. I sat in the leather ergonomic chair and woke the computer. It required no password, recognizing the biometric scan of a secure drive Liam had mailed to me a month ago, disguised as a novelty keychain. The screen blinked to life, displaying a single meticulously organized forensic ledger. I opened the master file and my breath caught in my throat. I am an auditor. I spot financial anomalies in seconds. The ledger was not just tracking his server profits, it was tracking his mother and sister. Row after row of data detailed a massive systemic financial conspiracy. Patricia and Brittany had been draining capital for years. I clicked into a subfolder labeled Unauthorized Disbursements. Scanned documents filled the screen. They were promissory notes, shadow mortgages, and high-interest corporate loans. Every single document bore Liam's signature, but as I zoomed in on the vector strokes, I saw the telltale signs of a digital forgery. The pressure points on the ink were completely uniform, lacking the natural hesitation of a human hand. Patricia and her golden child had been forging Liam's signature to siphon millions of dollars from his public business accounts. They were funding Brittany's lavish shopping addictions and Patricia's desperate need to maintain her country club lifestyle. Liam had discovered the massive secret loans a year ago. Instead of confronting them and triggering a messy public legal battle that would have dragged me into their toxic fallout, he quietly funneled his actual legitimate wealth into building this off-grid sanctuary. He created an untouchable asset completely hidden from the probate courts, the banks, and his predatory family. He knew Patricia would come for everything the second he was gone. He left me this impenetrable fortress so I could finally destroy them. The genius of his plan washed over me. He had weaponized his own apparent failure to give me the ultimate tactical advantage. Patricia thought she was foreclosing on a useless piece of dirt, while the actual value sat safely buried in encrypted servers. I continued scrolling through the ledger, memorizing the shell companies Brittany had set up to launder the stolen loan money. The sheer entitlement was staggering. They had ruined his public credit score while wearing designer gowns bought with his stolen funds. I reached for my phone, ready to start transferring the data to my secure auditing cloud. Suddenly, the heavy steel vault door behind me shuddered. The harsh glare of high-beam headlights slashed through the narrow ventilation grates at the top of the barn walls, casting long, erratic shadows across the server racks. The crunch of heavy tires rolling over wet gravel echoed loudly from the front yard. I quickly tapped the security feed icon on Liam's desktop monitor. The exterior cameras sprang to life, showing Patricia's luxury sport utility vehicle violently smashing through the rusted front gate of the farm. The heavy iron chains snapped and hit the mud. The vehicle skidded to a halt mere feet from the barn entrance. Patricia stepped out into the freezing rain, followed immediately by Brittany. From the back seat emerged a nervous-looking man, wearing a cheap, ill-fitting suit, holding a clipboard. They had not come to negotiate. They had broken into my property to steal it right out from under me. The heavy steel vault door glided shut with a pressurized hiss, sealing the millions of dollars in server equipment safely away in the subterranean chill. I quickly dragged the heavy, damp bales of hay back into place, completely concealing the biometric keypad and the reinforced metal frame. By the time I wiped the dirt from my hands and turned toward the barn entrance, the dilapidated wooden facade looked exactly like the rotting, worthless structure it was supposed to be. I stepped out from the darkness of the barn and into the freezing downpour, just as Patricia, Brittany, and the strange man marched through the thick mud of the yard. Patricia held a massive designer umbrella, careful to keep her expensive boots from sinking too deeply into the muck. The man trailing behind her offered no such grace. He looked absolutely miserable. "I told you I was not playing games, Natalie," Patricia announced, her voice cutting sharply through the sound of the heavy rain. She gestured grandly to the man shivering beside her. "Meet Mr. Vance. He is a state-certified property appraiser. I brought him here to officially evaluate this disaster." I stood my ground under the decaying overhang of the barn roof, crossing my arms over my chest. I watched Mr. Vance shift uncomfortably. He refused to look me in the eye. "Since your bank accounts are entirely frozen and the probate court is reviewing my dispute," Patricia continued, a victorious smirk spreading across her face, "the state will require a forced liquidation of Liam's physical assets to cover his outstanding debts. Mr. Vance here has already taken a preliminary look at the exterior. He assures me this contaminated wasteland is worth absolutely no more than $30,000. Brittany let out a sharp, mocking laugh and stepped out from under her mother's umbrella. The rain immediately began to ruin her perfect hair, but she was too caught up in her own malice to care. "You really thought you could outsmart us with a piece of paper and a rusty key?" Brittany sneered, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at me. "Mom always knows exactly how to handle distressed assets. She did the exact same thing to our father's company when they divorced. She stripped his business down to the absolute studs, devalued the commercial real estate through back-channel appraisals, and left him holding a bag of massive corporate debt. Now she is going to do it to Liam's mess. And you are going to be the one left bankrupt." I filed that piece of information away in my mental ledger. Patricia's history of fraudulent asset devaluation was a documented pattern, not an isolated incident. She had a playbook, and she was running the exact same play on me. I turned my attention away from the gloating women and focused entirely on the appraiser. Mr. Vance was sweating despite the biting cold of the Pacific Northwest storm. His suit was remarkably cheap, the fabric pulling awkwardly at the shoulders, and the hem of his trousers was frayed and soaked with mud. He clutched a standard aluminum clipboard against his chest, like a physical shield. A legitimate certified appraiser assessing a heavily damaged agricultural property would be carrying a laser measurement tool, a high-resolution digital camera, and a core soil testing kit to check for the contamination they claimed existed. Mr. Vance carried a single ballpoint pen. I narrowed my eyes, zeroing in on the top corner of the paperwork clipped to his board. It bore a faded, poorly printed logo. Vance Apex Valuations. I committed the business name and the man's nervous, shifting face to memory. He kept his gaze firmly fixed on the rusted tractor decaying in the yard, acting like a man who knew he was committing a crime and was terrified of being caught. $30,000. Patricia repeated, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "It is a tragic loss for you, Natalie. But since the estate owes me significantly more than that, due to the loans Liam supposedly took out, the probate judge will easily grant me the deed in a forced buyout to settle the balance." I will bulldoze this rotting wood tomorrow morning. Hand over the key now, and I will tell my lawyers to let you keep the cheap sedan you drove here in." I did not argue. I did not yell or threaten them with trespassing. A forensic auditor never acts on emotion. We operate exclusively on data. I reached into my pocket and slowly pulled out my smartphone. The screen illuminated my face in the dim gray light of the storm. I ignored Patricia's impatient demands and opened my mobile browser, navigating directly to the official state licensing registry for real estate professionals. "What are you doing?" Brittany snapped, taking an aggressive step closer. "Are you deaf? Mom gave you a direct order to hand over the key." I tuned her out completely. My thumb flew across the digital keyboard. I typed Arthur Vance into the search bar, followed by Apex Valuations. The government database processed the query for 2 agonizing seconds before the official public records populated on my screen. I read the bright red text stamped across his official state profile. I looked up from my phone, my eyes locking onto the nervous man in the cheap suit. I smiled a genuine, terrifying smile that made Mr. Vance take a physical step backward into the mud. Arthur Vance was not a certified appraiser. According to the state registry flashing brightly on my screen, his professional real estate license had been permanently revoked exactly 2 years and 4 months ago for executing multiple counts of severe commercial real estate fraud. Patricia had not brought an expert to value my land. She had brought a convicted con artist to steal it. Arthur Vance froze, his cheap shoes sinking inches into the saturated mud. I stepped out from under the decaying wooden overhang of the barn and marched directly toward him. I did not raise my voice. I did not adopt an aggressive physical posture. As a forensic auditor, I knew that weaponized data was always louder than shouting. "Your state appraisal license was permanently revoked in October 2024. I stated my words, cutting cleanly through the sound of the freezing rain. Furthermore, a quick search of the Secretary of State corporate registry shows that Vance Apex Valuations is currently registered to a residential address. Specifically, a 5-bedroom suburban house in Bellevue, Brittany's house." Brittany's smug expression instantly vanished, replaced by the wide-eyed, panicked look of a cornered animal. I closed the distance between myself and the shivering appraiser, pointing directly at the plastic clipboard clutched to his chest. "You are not here conducting a state-sanctioned property valuation. You are actively participating in a felony conspiracy to defraud a probate estate. When I forward this registry data along with the security footage of your unauthorized arrival on my property to the district attorney, you will be looking at federal wire fraud, trespassing, and conspiracy charges. And considering your prior convictions on the state registry, they will absolutely seek maximum sentencing." Vance did not hesitate. The clipboard slipped from his wet grasp, splashing face down into a deep puddle of muddy water. He spun around, nearly tripping over his own feet, and sprinted back toward the open passenger door of Patricia's luxury sport utility vehicle. "Get back here!" Brittany shrieked, her voice cracking with sudden hysteria. "We are paying you to write the report. Arthur, do not walk away from me. I am giving you a direct order." Vance ignored her completely. He scrambled into the back seat of the vehicle and slammed the door shut, immediately locking it from the inside. Brittany lunged at the SUV, pounding her fists against the tinted glass, completely abandoning any illusion of control. She screamed at him to open the door, her flawless makeup running down her face in dark streaks mixed with the heavy rain. Her entire master plan had unraveled in exactly 30 seconds. Just like every other time she faced genuine adversity in her heavily sheltered life, her only defense mechanism was a humiliating public temper tantrum. She was entirely incompetent without her mother's money to pave her way. Patricia did not panic. Unlike her daughter, she knew exactly how to pivot when backed into a corner. She slowly lowered her oversized designer umbrella, letting the freezing rain strike her face, completely shedding the grieving, concerned mother persona she had projected at the cemetery. Her eyes turned ice-cold, dead, and intensely calculating. "Fine," Patricia said, her voice a sharp, venomous hiss that carried easily over Brittany's screaming. "You want to play hardball, Natalie? We can play hardball." She reached into her expensive handbag and pulled out a thick, folded legal document enclosed in a waterproof vinyl sleeve. She threw it directly into the mud at my feet. I knew Liam was hiding something out here, Patricia sneered, stepping closer until she was invading my personal space. He thought he was so clever keeping his finances entirely separated from the family trust. But my private investigators found the paper trail 2 weeks before he died. He severely leveraged this property to fund whatever useless project he was working on. I bought the second mortgage on this wretched farm from a shadow lender 3 days ago. I own the debt. I stared at the vinyl sleeve resting in the mud, my analytical mind instantly calculating the severity of her threat. Shadow lenders operated outside traditional banking regulations. They utilized predatory lending terms, massive balloon payments, and aggressive collection tactics that traditional financial institutions avoided. "You owe me $200,000, Patricia announced, a cruel, triumphant smile spreading across her face. And because it is an unregulated shadow loan with an accelerated default clause, the entire balloon payment is due by this Friday at 5 in the evening. If those funds do not clear my account, I foreclose immediately. I seize the land, I seize whatever is rotting inside that barn, and I leave you with absolutely nothing." Patricia turned on her heel, grabbed Brittany by the arm, and shoved her screaming daughter into the passenger seat of the SUV. The vehicle roared to life, its tires spinning aggressively in the mud before tearing out through the broken iron gate and vanishing down the dark forested road. I picked up the muddy vinyl sleeve and walked straight back to the barn. I pulled the heavy wooden door shut, engaged the rusted padlock to maintain the illusion of an abandoned ruin, and practically ripped the heavy hay bales away from the hidden entrance. I punched our anniversary date into the biometric keypad. The steel vault door hissed open, and I rushed back into the freezing, brilliantly lit data center. The deafening hum of the server racks was exactly as I had left it, but something was terribly wrong. A massive red warning strobe was flashing rhythmically above the main central console, casting harsh crimson shadows across the polished anti-static floor. I sprinted to Liam's glass desk and dropped into the leather ergonomic chair. A high-priority system alert was dominating the primary monitor. The industrial power bill for the subterranean facility was severely past due. Liam had been using the shadow loans to keep the servers running while Patricia drained his public accounts, but his sudden death had halted the automated payments. A countdown timer flashed in the top right corner of the screen, indicating that the local utility company would cut the primary grid connection in less than 48 hours. I opened the master client ledger on the desktop. The servers were currently hosting a multi-million-dollar encrypted cloud storage contract for a massive international logistics firm. The contract stipulated an absolute zero downtime guarantee. If the power grid shut down and those servers went offline for even a single second, the entire multi-million-dollar contract would be instantly voided. I would lose the capital required to pay Patricia's shadow loan, and the only legitimate asset I had left to fight back with would be destroyed. The crimson warning strobe bathed the subterranean data center in a violent rhythmic pulse. I sat rigidly in Liam's ergonomic chair, staring at the countdown timer flashing in the upper right corner of the primary monitor. 48 hours. That was exactly how much time I had before the local utility company severed the main power grid connection to Pine Ridge Farm. My mind shifted instantly into forensic mode. I needed to understand the exact parameters of the crisis before I could neutralize it. I pulled the keyboard closer and began running a deep diagnostic trace on the active server partitions. Liam was brilliant, but he left breadcrumbs for anyone who knew how to read binary architecture. The system logs showed massive encrypted data packets routing through a proxy logistics company based out of Virginia. I bypassed the proxy firewall using his administrator credentials and dug straight into the root client directory. The actual end user was not a commercial logistics firm. The digital seal burning brightly on the screen belonged to the United States Department of Defense. My husband had not just built a secret server farm. He had secured a classified infrastructure contract to host heavily encrypted military defense algorithms. I opened the master contract file and read the terms. The current hosting agreement was set to automatically renew next Tuesday. The valuation of the contract renewal was $40 million. It was a staggering amount of money, enough to secure my future 10 times over and permanently destroy Patricia's leverage. But there was a single non-negotiable clause highlighted in bold red text. The contract demanded absolute continuous uptime. If the servers lost power and the encrypted handshake dropped for even 1 millisecond, the security protocol would trigger an automatic purge. The $40 million contract would be instantly and irrevocably voided. The servers would turn into expensive, useless metal. I pulled up the utility provider portal on the second monitor. The outstanding industrial power bill was exactly $15,000. I picked up my smartphone and tapped open my banking application. A bright red banner immediately covered the screen. Account frozen. Patricia and Brittany had effectively weaponized the probate court just as they promised. Every single checking and savings account linked to Liam's name was completely locked down under the legal dispute. I could not transfer a dime. I needed $15,000 in liquid cash to pay the utility company, and I had less than 2 days to get it. Panic is a useless emotion. It clouds judgment and slows reaction time. I closed my eyes, took a sharp breath of the freezing conditioned air, and formulated a solution. Patricia thought she had backed me into an inescapable corner. She assumed I was entirely dependent on Liam's wealth. She severely underestimated my personal financial discipline. I locked the server interface, secured the steel vault door, and marched back out into the freezing rain. I got into my car and drove straight back to the city. I did not go home. I drove directly to the downtown corporate branch of Northeast Mutual. My clothes were still damp, and my boots left faint, muddy footprints on the polished marble floor of the bank lobby, but I did not care about appearances. I bypassed the long line of customers waiting for the tellers and walked straight into the glass-walled office of Marcus Vance. Marcus was the senior branch manager. I had audited his branch 3 years ago and caught a systemic reporting error that saved him from a massive federal compliance fine. He owed me a favor. Marcus looked up from his desk, his eyes widening in surprise at my disheveled state. Before he could offer his condolences for Liam, I sat down in the leather chair across from him and placed my driver's license flat on his desk. I need a cashier's check for $15,000, printed immediately, I told him, keeping my voice low and authoritative. Marcus frowned, pulling up my profile on his computer. Natalie, your joint accounts are flagged under an active probate dispute. I cannot authorize any withdrawals from those funds. The legal department would fire me on the spot. I am not asking for Liam's money, I replied smoothly. I am executing a hardship withdrawal on my personal independent 401k retirement account, the one completely untethered from the estate. Marcus stared at me, his professional demeanor slipping into genuine concern. Natalie, you are a senior financial auditor. You know exactly what happens if you liquidate an active retirement account before maturity. The federal penalty fees and the immediate tax liabilities will be astronomical. You will lose nearly 40% of your total accrued savings right off the top. It is absolute financial suicide. Print the check, Marcus, I commanded, refusing to break eye contact. I was betting my entire independent financial future, the safety net I had spent a decade painstakingly building, on Liam's hidden servers. If the defense contract failed, I would be left with nothing. But I was fiercely independent, and I was not going to let Patricia and Brittany win. I would burn my own retirement to the ground before I let them steal Liam's legacy. Marcus let out a heavy sigh, realizing I would not be swayed. He clicked through the rigorous authorization prompts on his screen, his keyboard clacking loudly in the quiet office. "Give me 1 moment," he said, standing up and grabbing a specialized manager keycard from his drawer. "I have to physically approve a withdrawal this large at the master terminal behind the teller line. I will be right back." He stepped out of the glass office, leaving the door slightly ajar. He also made a critical amateur security mistake. He left his dual monitor system unlocked and fully active. My forensic instincts took over instantly. I leaned forward in my chair, my eyes scanning the dense columns of financial data illuminating his screen. Marcus had been reviewing an internal suspicious activity queue before I walked in. The bank's automated fraud detection software had flagged a series of highly erratic transactions. I read the name attached to the flagged accounts, and my heart hammered against my ribs. Brittany. I narrowed my eyes quickly, memorizing the routing numbers, the massive dollar amounts, and the time stamps. A frantic sequence of international wire transfers was actively bouncing back and forth across the screen. Brittany was aggressively moving huge sums of money from a series of untraceable offshore accounts in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands directly into her personal checking. The moment the funds hit her local account, they were instantly rerouted to a corporate holding firm I did not recognize. The sheer velocity and deliberate obfuscation of the transfers screamed of desperate, panicked money laundering. Brittany was trying to wash millions of stolen dollars through the banking system, and the digital trail was currently imploding right in front of my eyes. Marcus stepped back into the glass-walled office, completely oblivious to the fact that I had just memorized the exact blueprint of my sister-in-law's financial crimes. He handed me the cashier's check for $15,000, his face heavily lined with professional disapproval. He gave me a stern warning about early withdrawal tax penalties, but I simply thanked him, took the paper, and walked out into the freezing rain. Before I even reached my car, I accessed the utility provider's emergency payment portal on my phone and entered the routing numbers. The transaction cleared instantly. The industrial grid powering Liam's subterranean data center was secured. The $40 million Department of Defense contract was safe. With the immediate crisis neutralized, my mind shifted entirely to the offensive. I drove straight back to my townhouse, locked the deadbolt, and transformed my living room into a forensic war room. I cleared the coffee table, pushing aside decorative magazines to make room for my primary workstation, a secondary laptop, and a towering stack of blank printer paper. I brewed a pot of black coffee and sat down. I was no longer a grieving widow scrambling for survival. I was a senior financial auditor on the hunt, and I was about to dismantle Patricia and Brittany's empire brick by brick. I started with the holding company I had spotted on Marcus's screen. Using public corporate filings and my legitimate access to state registry databases, I traced the digital footprint of the shell corporation. It was registered in Delaware, under a generic name, Apex Holdings International. I immediately cross-referenced the registration data with Vance Apex Valuations, the fake appraisal company Patricia had brought to the farm. The registered agent for both entities was exactly the same. They were operating a closed loop of fabricated businesses passing money back and forth to create the illusion of legitimate commercial activity. But a shell company is just an empty vessel. It requires fuel. I needed to know exactly where Brittany was getting the millions of dollars she was frantically washing through offshore accounts. I pulled up public property tax records, vehicle registration databases, and basic credit background checks. Brittany drove a luxury imported SUV, lived in a sprawling 5-bedroom house in Bellevue, and maintained a lifestyle that required at least $30,000 a month in liquid cash. Yet according to public tax filings, her legitimate reported income was absolutely zero. She had not held a W-2 employment position in over 8 years. The math did not align, and in my profession, when the math fails, it means someone is lying. I dug deeper into the offshore routing numbers I had memorized at the bank, tracing the origin point of the incoming international wires. The money was not coming from a foreign investor. It was being funneled out of a domestic account, bounced through Cyprus to hide its origin, and then dropped back into Brittany's personal checking. I accessed the county probate and public trust registries, running a search on Brittany's immediate dependents. The search results illuminated my screen and made my blood run cold. The money was originating from an educational trust fund established by Brittany's late ex-husband for their 7-year-old son. Brittany was not a mastermind investor. She was a parasite. She was systematically draining her own child's legally protected future, liquidating his college fund and inheritance to finance her designer wardrobe and luxury vacations. She was washing the stolen trust funds offshore to avoid triggering a mandatory audit by the state's family court. The sheer depravity of her actions sharpened my focus. I continued pulling data mapping the exact flow of the stolen cash. A horrific realization began to form as I connected the final dots on my screen. Patricia had stood in the mud at the farm and proudly announced that she had purchased the second mortgage from a shadow lender for $200,000. I pulled the property deed history for Pine Ridge Farm, the shadow lender listed on the lien was Apex Holdings International. The entire scheme unraveled before me in crystal clear clarity. There was no shadow lender. There was no legitimate debt collection. Patricia and Brittany had created a fake holding company. Brittany had stolen $200,000 from her own son's trust fund, washed it through the offshore accounts, and used that exact stolen money to buy the fraudulent mortgage on Liam's farm. Patricia was using her own grandson's stolen inheritance to illegally foreclose on my property and leave me destitute. They had weaponized their own flesh and blood to steal an asset they believed was only worth $30,000, completely unaware that they were actually trying to steal a $40 million military defense infrastructure. They had committed federal wire fraud, interstate money laundering, and grand theft. They had handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them both, neatly wrapped in a digital paper trail. I began printing every single registry document, every routing trace, and every trust fund withdrawal record, compiling an impenetrable dossier of their felony conspiracy. The heavy rain continued to lash against the windows of my townhouse, mirroring the storm raging inside my mind. I was just organizing the final stack of printed evidence when 3 sharp, heavy knocks echoed from my front door. I froze my eyes, darting to the digital clock on my laptop screen. It was past 9 at night. No one knew I had returned to the city except the bank manager, and Patricia believed I was trapped out at the farm facing imminent ruin. I walked quietly to the entryway and checked the security camera feed on my phone. Standing on my porch, drenched from the freezing rain, was DeAndre. He was a senior fraud investigator from my auditing firm, a man I had explicitly trusted with the most sensitive corporate espionage cases over the last 5 years. I had sent him an encrypted message hours ago asking him to pull physical notarized copies of the probate court filings. He was standing under the dim porch light, his thick coat soaked through, gripping a massive stack of sealed manila folders tightly against his chest. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, ready to initiate the final phase of my retaliation. DeAndre stepped out of the freezing downpour and into the warmth of my living room, shedding his heavy, soaked winter coat. He dropped a massive stack of sealed manila folders onto my coffee table, right beside my glowing laptop screen. He looked utterly exhausted, the deep lines around his mouth and eyes betraying nights of lost sleep and mounting stress. "I know what Brittany did," DeAndre stated, his voice a low, hard rumble that carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I saw the withdrawal from my son's account. They think I am just a dumb contractor who does not check the mail." Brittany and Patricia had always severely underestimated him. When Brittany divorced DeAndre 3 years ago, she stripped him of his contracting business, took primary custody of their son, and publicly mocked his intelligence to anyone who would listen. What neither of those arrogant women knew was that I had immediately reached out to him. I recognized his meticulous attention to detail, his relentless work ethic, and his sharp analytical mind. I hired him at my auditing firm and sponsored his forensic accounting certifications, turning the man they had discarded as a blue-collar laborer into my most lethal and trusted financial investigator. To Brittany and Patricia, he was still just the guy who used to swing a hammer. They had absolutely no idea he possessed the exact corporate espionage skill set required to track their offshore money laundering. DeAndre began pacing the length of my living room, the anger radiating from him in palpable waves. He recounted the sheer volume of psychological abuse he had endured during his marriage to Brittany. It was not just the financial manipulation or the constant belittling of his career. It was Patricia's relentless, suffocating racial microaggressions. She used to pull Brittany aside at family dinners, DeAndre said, his jaw locked tight as he stared at the wall. Patricia would whisper about how my presence lowered the perceived value of their social standing. She constantly reminded me to keep my voice down in their gated neighborhood, treating me like a security threat rather than a son-in-law. I swallowed my pride. I took every single one of her veiled insults and smiled politely, because fighting back meant Patricia would hire expensive lawyers to take my son away permanently. I endured their toxic, racist garbage for years just to ensure I could remain a father to my boy. He stopped pacing and pointed directly at the laptop screen, displaying the emptied trust fund. But this crosses every single line, DeAndre growled. Brittany drained his future to buy designer shoes and fund her mother's schemes. I am done playing the quiet, compliant ex-husband. They want a war. They are going to get a war. He reached for the thick manila folders he had dropped on the table and ripped the heavy tape off the top. You sent me to pull the probate court filings, but I dug deeply into the county development archives while I was inside the municipal database, DeAndre explained, pulling out a stack of documents. I found exactly why Patricia is accelerating this foreclosure and demanding that shadow loan payment by Friday. She does not just want to sell the dirt, she has a massive coordinated development mapped out. DeAndre spread a series of large, glossy architectural blueprints across the coffee table. They were highly detailed commercial zoning maps. I leaned over the documents, tracing the boundary lines with my index finger. The maps perfectly outlined the exact perimeter of Pine Ridge Farm, but the rotting barn and the overgrown fields were completely erased. In their place sat a sleek modern architectural rendering of a high-end commercial plaza. A luxury strip mall, I observed, reading the bold project title stamped in the bottom right corner of the primary blueprint. Exactly, DeAndre confirmed. Patricia is not operating within the bounds of the law. Pine Ridge Farm is strictly zoned for agricultural use. It takes years of community hearings and hundreds of thousands of dollars in environmental impact surveys to legally rezone that land for commercial development. Patricia bypassed all of it. I tracked a secondary wire transfer from her holding company directly into the offshore account of the county zoning commissioner. She bribed a sitting government official to rubber stamp the rezoning permits. I studied the projected financial prospectus attached to the blueprints. Patricia had already secured aggressive pre-lease agreements from a high-end corporate coffee chain, a boutique fitness studio, and a luxury organic grocery store. The total projected valuation of the completed strip mall was exactly $5 million. The entire scope of her ambition laid bare on my coffee table. Patricia had orchestrated a multi-layered felony conspiracy. She committed mortgage fraud using a fake shell company, engaged in interstate money laundering using her grandson's stolen trust fund, and executed the federal bribery of a government official. She was rushing the foreclosure and threatening me with the fraudulent shadow loan because her commercial construction crews were scheduled to break ground next Monday morning. She needed my land cleared and bulldozed immediately to build her $5 million suburban empire. I looked down at the glossy, expensive rendering of the luxury strip mall. Then I looked up at my laptop screen where the Department of Defense server protocols were currently securing $40 million in highly classified military data beneath the floorboards of that rotting barn. A laugh bubbled up in my chest. It started as a low, quiet chuckle and rapidly escalated into a full, resonant laugh that echoed loudly through the quiet townhouse. DeAndre stopped talking and stared at me, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. Natalie, I just told you she bribed a public official to bulldoze your property and leave you with absolutely nothing, DeAndre said, taking a cautious step forward. Why are you laughing? I wiped a single tear of pure dark amusement from the corner of my eye and looked up at my brilliant investigator. Because DeAndre Patricia is risking 20 years in a federal penitentiary for bribery and fraud just to build a $5 million strip mall. And she is going to send heavy industrial bulldozers to dig up the foundation of that barn next Monday, completely unaware that she is attempting to excavate a heavily fortified, active Department of Defense grid worth $40 million. I transferred the $15,000 to the utility company through their emergency commercial portal. The confirmation screen flashed green, followed instantly by a text alert from the Pine Ridge Farm security grid. The localized power restrictions were lifted. I sat back in my living room, watching my remote terminal link to Liam's subterranean servers. The violent crimson warning strobes on my dashboard faded, replaced by a steady pulsing blue. The system temperature regulated. The cooling fans hummed in perfect, uninterrupted harmony. The encrypted handshake with the Department of Defense stabilized at maximum bandwidth. Less than an hour later, a highly secured email dropped into the root administrative inbox. I entered Liam's master decryption key and opened the file. It was the official contract renewal from the Pentagon. $40 million fully guaranteed locked in for the next operational cycle. Liam had built a digital fortress, and I had just secured its walls. The estate, the money, the future, it was all mine. With the farm protected, I turned my attention to the stack of blueprints and financial records DeAndre had pulled. I cleared my secondary monitor and opened a blank PDF of IRS Form 211. It was the official application for award for original information, the federal whistleblower form used to report massive systemic tax evasion. For the next 6 hours, the only sounds in my townhouse were the rhythmic clacking of my keyboard and the heavy rain beating against the glass. I was not just building a defense, I was meticulously constructing a federal indictment. Patricia had operated her fake appraisal businesses and shell companies like a feudal lord, assuming her wealth and country club status made her invisible to the IRS. She was wrong. I traced the financial architecture of Apex Holdings International and cross-referenced it with the tax identification numbers DeAndre had provided. The arrogance of Patricia's operation was staggering. She had completely bypassed filing corporate tax returns for 7 consecutive years. She was funneling millions of dollars in undocumented cash through Apex Holdings to fund her lavish lifestyle, her real estate acquisitions, and her political bribes. She had evaded federal taxes on a massive scale, relying on a network of corrupt local officials and fraudulent paperwork to mask her income. I filled out IRS Form 211 with surgical precision. Line by line, I detailed the exact routing numbers, the offshore transfer dates, and the specific property deeds she had purchased with laundered money. I attached the municipal blueprints DeAndre had found, proving her $5 million commercial strip mall was financed entirely by illicit, untaxed funds. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division did not just audit tax evaders of this magnitude. They seized their assets, froze their accounts, and sent them to federal prison. As an added bonus, the federal government legally required the IRS to pay whistleblowers up to 30% of the recovered funds. I was literally going to be paid a fortune by the United States government to financially annihilate my mother-in-law. I collated the final pages, placed them into a thick binder, and sealed it. The forensic trap was set. Now I needed the appropriate armor. The sun was just rising over the city skyline when I left my townhouse and drove to an exclusive high-end boutique in the financial district. For years, Patricia had dictated my wardrobe for her country club events. She had constantly pressured me to wear muted pastels, beige cardigans, and conservative dresses designed to make me blend in and look appropriately subservient. I was the poor daughter-in-law, and she expected me to dress like I was apologizing for my presence. I walked past the racks of sensible navy and cream dresses and approached the boutique owner. I demanded a custom-tailored business suit. I explicitly rejected everything subtle. I chose a sharp, structured, blood-red fabric that demanded absolute attention. The tailor worked quickly, pinning the blazer to nip perfectly at my waist and hemming the trousers to fall precisely over a pair of black, pointed-toe stiletto heels. The suit was a weapon. The sharp lapels and the striking, aggressive crimson color completely transformed my silhouette. I looked in the full-length mirror, and the woman staring back at me was not a grieving widow or a terrified victim fighting for a farmhouse. She was a corporate predator ready to execute a hostile takeover. I paid for the suit, slipped on my stilettos, and grabbed my leather briefcase containing the Form 211 dossier and the $40 million Department of Defense contract. My phone vibrated in my hand. It was a secure text message from DeAndre. He was already on site at the Oak Ridge Country Club disguised as a vendor coordinating the audiovisual equipment for Patricia's afternoon luncheon. I opened the message. "Investors are here. The mayor is here. She is setting you up for a public slaughter." Patricia had gathered the town's most powerful politicians and her wealthy financial backers in one room. She had invited me to this luncheon under the guise of discussing Liam's estate, but her true intention was obvious. She planned to ambush me in front of the entire country club. She was going to reveal the fraudulent shadow mortgage, humiliate me publicly, and force me to sign over the deed to Pine Ridge Farm while the mayor and her investors watched. She wanted to break me in front of an audience, solidifying her dominance and clearing the path for her $5 million strip mall. She had absolutely no idea that her strip mall was built on top of a classified military grid. She had no idea I held the federal whistleblower forms detailing her 7 years of tax evasion. I gripped the handle of my briefcase, the blood-red fabric of my suit catching the light, and typed my response to DeAndre. Good. I want an audience. The valet stand at the Oak Ridge Country Club was a parade of European luxury vehicles and aggressive old money privilege. The rain had finally broken, leaving behind a heavy, damp chill in the Seattle air. I handed over the keys to my car, gripped my leather briefcase, and walked purposefully toward the grand entrance. The heavy oak doors swung open, releasing the ambient hum of 100 quiet, calculating conversations. The grand ballroom was packed with the city's financial elite. City council members, venture capitalists, and commercial real estate developers mingled beneath towering crystal chandeliers, sipping expensive champagne from delicate flutes. They were all dressed in the unspoken uniform of the upper-class subdued navy blazers, conservative beige sheath dresses, and muted pastel cardigans. My custom-tailored blood-red business suit acted as an immediate and violent disruptor in the room. I looked like a walking target, a stark crimson warning sign cutting through a sea of polite neutrality. Heads turned as I navigated the plush carpeting. Conversations paused as I passed. I did not break my stride, scanning the room until I spotted the architect of this entire charade. Patricia was holding court near the center of the ballroom, flanked closely by the mayor and a group of prominent local investors. She was putting on a masterclass in emotional manipulation. She dabbed delicately at the corners of her eyes with a lace handkerchief, dropping her shoulders just enough to project the image of a fragile, grieving mother. She was playing the tragic victim to absolute perfection. I moved closer, remaining just out of her direct line of sight, and listened to the narrative she was actively spinning. She was lamenting the heartbreaking loss of Liam, her voice wavering with practiced grief. Then seamlessly she pivoted to her fake concern for me. She told the mayor that Liam had left behind a disastrous financial mess. She painted me as a helpless, incompetent widow, completely overwhelmed by the rural estate and drowning in debt. She was laying the psychological groundwork for the crowd, framing herself as the benevolent matriarch stepping in to rescue her son's destitute wife from total ruin. The investors nodded sympathetically, completely oblivious to the fact that the weeping woman before them was actively funding a multi-million-dollar commercial development with money stolen from her own grandson. Before I could reach the center of the room to intercept her, a sharp, grating voice cut through the elegant string music playing in the background. Brittany stepped directly into my path, completely blocking my advance. She was flanked by 3 of her equally polished, diamond-draped friends. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on the sharp lapels of my crimson jacket, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. She leaned forward, raising her voice just enough to ensure her wealthy audience caught every single word. "Did you buy that off the rack? It is a little aggressive for a widow facing foreclosure, do you not think?" Brittany laughed, a high mocking sound that made her friends giggle in unison. "Do not worry. Mom will give you a little allowance once you sign the farm over today. We cannot have Liam's widow living on the streets. Just sign the deed transfer she prepared, take your little stipend, and quietly disappear." The sheer audacity of her statement was staggering. She was standing in a $5,000 designer dress mocking my finances, completely unaware that I had spent the entire night tracing the exact offshore routing numbers she used to drain her 7-year-old son's trust fund to pay for that very lifestyle. I did not flinch. I did not offer a defensive retort, and I certainly did not engage with her pathetic attempt at public humiliation. I simply maintained dead-level eye contact, let a chilling, silent smile cross my face, and walked right past her. I bumped her shoulder just hard enough to force her to step aside, leaving Brittany standing with her mouth slightly open, her insult hanging uselessly in the air. I had a much larger target in my sights, and I refused to be distracted by the foot soldiers. I navigated the perimeter of the sprawling ballroom, moving purposefully toward the elevated audiovisual control booth tucked into the dark back corner of the venue. DeAndre was exactly where he said he would be. Dressed in a generic black polo shirt and dark slacks, He was expertly playing the role of a background club technician. He was crouched behind a massive digital soundboard pretending to adjust the complex wiring on a towering speaker monitor. I stopped casually beside the booth, turning my body toward the crowd to completely shield my movements from Patricia's line of sight. I unlatched my leather briefcase and retrieved a small, heavily encrypted flash drive. It contained the ultimate weapon. It held the digitized IRS, Form 211 whistleblower, documents the Delaware Shell Company, registrations, the offshore routing traces detailing Brittany's theft, the architectural blueprints for the $5 million strip mall, and the classified $40 million Department of Defense contract. I tapped the edge of the soundboard twice. DeAndre reached down without looking up from his wires, and I smoothly dropped the flash drive directly into his palm. "Cue it up," I murmured, keeping my eyes fixed on the milling crowd. "Tap into their main presentation feed. Override the primary projection screen behind the podium the second I give you the signal." DeAndre slipped the drive into his pocket and gave me a single sharp nod of confirmation. The alliance was set. The ammunition was loaded. I stepped away from the booth and positioned myself at the edge of the main crowd, crossing my arms over my crimson jacket. The trap was fully primed. I just needed Patricia to walk directly into it. A sharp ringing sound suddenly pierced the ambient chatter of the ballroom. Clink, clink, clink. Patricia stood beside the mahogany podium at the front of the room, tapping a silver spoon against her crystal champagne glass. She commanded the room with practiced, arrogant ease. The overlapping conversations immediately died down, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. The string quartet stopped playing. The wealthy investors turned toward the stage. The mayor took a respectful step back to give her the floor. Patricia adjusted the microphone, a look of grim determination masking her absolute triumph. She scanned the silent room, her eyes deliberately searching the crowd until they locked onto my red suit. A predatory, victorious smile flashed across her face. The trap was sprung. The low murmur of the Seattle elite immediately ceased. Mayors, city council members, and venture capitalists turned their full attention to the grieving matriarch. I remained standing near the back, my crimson suit a glaring beacon against the sea of navy and beige. I crossed my arms and waited. "Thank you all for being here today," Patricia began, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated emotion. She reached up to dab the corner of her eye with a lace handkerchief. "As many of you know, my family recently suffered an unimaginable tragedy. Losing my son Liam has left a void in our hearts that can never be filled. He was brilliant, ambitious, and deeply loved." A collective sigh of sympathy rippled through the ballroom. The mayor, standing just to the right of the stage, bowed his head respectfully. Patricia paused, letting the heavy silence do its work, establishing her absolute control over the emotional temperature of the room. "But Liam, for all his brilliance, had a dreamer's heart." Patricia continued, her tone shifting from mournful to deeply patronizing. "He pursued rural passions that unfortunately blinded him to practical realities. He purchased a piece of property, a farm, with grand visions that simply never materialized. And in his sudden passing, he left behind more than just a grieving family. He left behind a catastrophic financial burden." Patricia turned her gaze directly toward me. Hundreds of eyes followed her line of sight, pinning me against the back wall. The pity in the room was palpable, thick, and suffocating. "My poor daughter-in-law, Natalie, is currently drowning in the debts my son tragically left behind," Patricia announced, her voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system DeAndre was currently monitoring. "She is facing immediate foreclosure. She is facing absolute financial ruin. The shadow loans on that farm are staggering, and she has been left entirely alone to shoulder a burden she simply cannot carry." The whispering began. Wealthy investors leaned into one another, casting judgmental glances in my direction. In their eyes, my sharp red suit was no longer a symbol of power. It was the desperate, inappropriate flailing of a woman who had lost everything and did not know how to quietly accept her defeat. I maintained steady eye contact with Patricia, refusing to shrink under the collective scrutiny. "But family protects family," Patricia declared, raising her chin magnanimously. "We do not abandon our own in their darkest hour. We step up. We carry the weight. She gestured to a group of men standing near the front row. I recognized them immediately from the architectural blueprints DeAndre had pulled. They were the commercial developers, the men ready to pour concrete for her $5 million strip mall. That is why today I am making a formal public declaration, Patricia proclaimed, her voice ringing with absolute manufactured heroism. I cannot bring my son back, but I can save his widow from total bankruptcy. Tonight, I am publicly purchasing Liam's failed farm for $50,000 to save Natalie from total bankruptcy. I am paying liquid cash to completely absorb the toxic debt, clear the shadow liens, and allow Natalie to walk away from this nightmare with a clean slate. I am taking this worthless piece of dirt off her hands so she can finally heal. A smattering of polite, impressed applause broke out near the front of the room. The mayor smiled warmly, clearly moved by this display of maternal sacrifice. Patricia had orchestrated a masterpiece. She had framed her hostile takeover, her bribery, and her money laundering as an act of profound selfless charity. She was stealing a $40 million Department of Defense black site, paving it over for a $5 million commercial plaza, and getting a round of applause for paying me $50,000 to go away. The sheer, unadulterated sociopathy of it was breathtaking. I did not move. I did not blink. I waited for the final phase of her ambush. Right on cue, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. Brittany strutted down the center aisle, her chin held high, holding a thick blue-backed legal document. She was playing the role of the dutiful messenger, but the vicious, triumphant gleam in her eyes betrayed her true nature. She walked straight up to the small cocktail table where I was standing. The entire ballroom watched in breathless silence. They thought they were witnessing an act of grace. They thought they were watching a ruined woman being thrown a lifeline. Brittany slammed the thick legal document down onto the glass surface of the cocktail table. It was the transfer deed, fully drafted, relinquishing all of my rights, titles, and interests in Pine Ridge Farm over to Apex Holdings International. Next to the document, she slammed down a heavy gold-plated fountain pen. The sharp clatter of metal against glass echoed sharply in the quiet room. Brittany leaned in close, ensuring the crowd could not hear her actual words over the soft instrumental music that had just resumed playing. The mask of familial concern vanished entirely from her face, replaced by the ugly, parasitic sneer of a woman who thought she had just won a war she never actually fought. "Sign it," Brittany whispered maliciously, her voice dripping with venom, "or you leave here with nothing." I looked down at the transfer deed resting on the glass table, then up at Brittany's expectant, greedy face. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, waiting for the broken widow to concede defeat. They waited for me to sign away my future, my husband's legacy, and the $40 million secret buried beneath my feet. I reached out and picked up the heavy gold-plated fountain pen. I rolled it between my fingers, feeling its weight, letting the silence stretch until it became agonizing. Then I stood up. I pushed my chair back, the scrape of wood against the floorboards, cutting sharply through the quiet room. I squared my shoulders, letting the sharp lines of my crimson suit command the space. I gripped both ends of the expensive fountain pen. With one sudden, violent twist of my wrists, I snapped it completely in half. The loud, sharp crack echoed through the vaulted ceiling of the ballroom like a gunshot. Black ink splattered across the crisp white tablecloth, bleeding directly over the signature line of the fraudulent deed. Several gasps erupted from the front row. Brittany jumped back, her eyes wide with shock, as droplets of dark ink dotted the hem of her expensive designer dress. She looked at her ruined garment, then at my face, her malicious smirk completely dissolving into pure, unadulterated shock. I dropped the broken halves of the pen onto the ruined contract. I did not look at Brittany. I turned my full, unyielding attention directly to the woman standing at the podium. "You forgot to do your due diligence, Patricia." I projected my voice, making sure it carried to the furthest corners of the room. It was not the trembling voice of a defeated victim. It was the absolute, commanding tone of an executioner. "You spent all those years treating me like a naive, uneducated girl who simply filed tax returns for local bakeries. You thought I was just a low-level accountant who lacked the intelligence to understand your financial maneuvers." Patricia's practiced expression of maternal sorrow faltered. A flicker of genuine confusion rapidly followed by a spark of apprehension crossed her face. She gripped the edges of the mahogany podium, her knuckles turning white. "I am not a tax preparer," I announced, my voice cutting through the rising whispers of the country club elite. "I am a forensic auditor. I hunt white-collar criminals for a living. I track hidden assets, I dismantle offshore shell companies, and I build federal indictments against arrogant people who believe their wealth makes them invisible to the law. You brought a knife to a gunfight, Patricia, and you did not even bother to check if I was armed." The mayor, standing just a few feet away from the stage, shifted uncomfortably. He tugged at his collar, his political survival instincts kicking into overdrive. The wealthy investors who had just been applauding Patricia's supposed charity now exchanged nervous, calculating glances. They recognized the terminology. They understood the immediate threat radiating from my words. Patricia recovered quickly, attempting to salvage her meticulously crafted performance. "Natalie, sweetheart," she said, forcing a condescending, pitying smile. "The grief is clearly making you delusional. You are having a public breakdown. Please let us help you before you embarrass yourself any further." "I am perfectly lucid," I replied coldly. "But your investors deserve to know exactly what kind of criminal enterprise they are funding." I turned my gaze away from the stage and looked straight toward the dark audiovisual booth at the back of the ballroom. I found DeAndre's silhouette in the shadows. I gave him a single definitive nod. The transition was instantaneous. DeAndre killed the main breakers for the ballroom's ambient lighting. The elegant, warm glow of the chandeliers extinguished, plunging the massive room into near darkness. Murmurs of confusion and alarm rippled through the crowd of politicians and socialites. Before anyone could call for security, the massive dual projector screens mounted directly behind Patricia flashed to life. The blinding high-definition light illuminated the stage, casting Patricia in a stark, unforgiving silhouette against the glowing white background. DeAndre had hijacked the entire visual presentation system. The serene pastoral images of the country club that had previously adorned the screens vanished. In their place, a highly magnified, razor-sharp image of a legal document dominated the display. It was the shadow mortgage. Every detail, every routing number, and every forged signature was magnified for the entire room to see. "What is the meaning of this?" Patricia demanded, her voice losing its measured grace, spiking with genuine panic. She turned around, shielding her eyes against the glare of the projectors, staring up at the documents displayed behind her. "Turn those screens off immediately. That is the $50,000 debt you so graciously offered to absorb," I stated, my voice echoing through the sound system DeAndre had seamlessly integrated with my lapel microphone. "A debt registered to Apex Holdings International, a company incorporated in Delaware, completely untraceable, except for the offshore routing numbers that happen to match your primary investment accounts." DeAndre hit the next cue. The screen split in half. On the left side remained the fraudulent mortgage deed. On the right side, a new document appeared. It was the official state certification of the real estate appraiser Patricia had hired to artificially tank the value of Pine Ridge Farm. But it was not a standard license. Stamped diagonally across the document in massive, undeniable red letters were two words: expired, fraudulent. The atmosphere in the ballroom shifted from confused discomfort to outright panicked alarm. These were not ordinary citizens watching a family squabble. These were venture capitalists, corporate lawyers, and career politicians. They possessed a predatory instinct for legal liability. They recognized exactly what they were looking at. They were staring at incontrovertible proof of interstate wire fraud, real estate manipulation, and criminal conspiracy displayed in 50-foot letters on a projection screen. The investors who had been sitting in the front row, the very men prepared to break ground on Patricia's strip mall next week, suddenly sat up straight. The relaxed, confident posture of the elite completely vanished. They began frantically whispering to one another, pulling out their smartphones, their eyes darting nervously between the damning evidence on the screen and Patricia's rigid, terrified posture on the stage. The mayor took two large, deliberate steps backward, physically distancing himself from Patricia and her podium. The room was no longer a celebration of wealth and dominance. They realized instantly that they were trapped in a room with a massive federal crime, and the evidence was being broadcast for everyone to see. The suffocating silence in the ballroom shattered into absolute chaos. The collective realization of the massive federal crime displayed on the screens hit the wealthy crowd like a physical shockwave. Men in tailored suits scrambled backward, physically distancing themselves from the podium. The mayor was already power walking toward the emergency exit, his security detail frantically trying to keep up. Patricia spun around, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror as she stared at the 50-foot projection of her own fraudulent documents. The color drained completely from her face, leaving her pale and trembling beneath the stage lights. She lunged toward the microphone, her perfectly manicured facade disintegrating into pure desperation. "Cut the feed!" Patricia shrieked, her voice cracking as she pointed a shaking finger toward the dark audiovisual booth. She slammed her hand against the mahogany podium. "She is lying. She is a broke widow. I own the mortgage on that land. It forecloses tomorrow." DeAndre did not move a muscle. He stood in the shadows of the control booth, arms crossed, letting her frantic commands echo uselessly across the room. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply tapped the screen of my tablet. The massive projectors behind Patricia shifted instantly. The image of the forged deed vanished, replaced by a crystal-clear verified bank clearing statement bearing the official seal of a Federal Reserve Bank. The transaction numbers were highlighted in bright, undeniable green. "Actually," I stated, my voice projecting smoothly over the murmurs of the panicked crowd, "the $200,000 mortgage was paid in full yesterday." I gestured toward the glowing screen, making sure every investor in the room could read the clearing details. "The funds were wired directly into your offshore shell company by Cloud Data LLC. I explained, watching Patricia's eyes dart wildly as she read the transfer confirmation. "A company I own 100%. I stepped away from the cocktail table where Brittany was still standing, frozen in shock. My stiletto heels clicked sharply against the polished hardwood floor as I closed the distance to the stage. The crowd of elites parted for me instinctively. They were no longer looking at me with pity. They were looking at me with absolute, terrified respect. My blood-red suit was the only vibrant thing in the dim room, a visual anchor drawing every eye as I ascended the short staircase and stepped directly onto the stage next to my mother-in-law. Patricia shrank back, clutching the edge of the podium as if it were a life raft. Her breath came in short, jagged gasps. "You thought you were so incredibly brilliant," I said, my voice dropping to a hard, commanding register. "You tried to steal a farm you thought was worth $5 million for a strip mall." I tapped my tablet one final time. The bank statement disappeared. In its place, the official seal of the United States Department of Defense filled the massive screens. Beside it was the heavily redacted, fully executed vendor contract with the final valuation circled in bright red. The number was so large it caused several prominent venture capitalists in the front row to actually gasp aloud. "What you failed to understand, Patricia, is what my husband actually built," I announced, turning to face the crowd. "You didn't know Liam built a $40 million encrypted data center under that dirt, and it's all mine." The ballroom erupted. The investors who had previously pledged millions to Patricia's strip mall project were now shouting into their cell phones, furiously instructing their legal teams to sever all ties with Apex Holdings International. The socialites who had spent the last hour praising Patricia were now staring at her with profound disgust. She had not just committed a crime, she had committed the ultimate sin in their world. She had been publicly outsmarted and exposed as a massive financial liability. Patricia opened her mouth to speak, to offer some kind of defense, but no words came out. She was entirely defeated, crushed beneath the weight of her own arrogant ignorance. But the absolute destruction of Patricia's empire was not quite finished. Down on the main floor, Brittany had been staring at the projection screens in a state of catatonic shock. The math was rapidly connecting in her mind. DeAndre's investigation had proven that Brittany drained her 7-year-old son's trust fund just days ago, transferring exactly $200,000 into Patricia's holding company. She had stolen her own child's future to fund what she believed was a guaranteed, ruthless land grab. Suddenly, Brittany shoved her way past a group of fleeing politicians. Her designer dress caught on a chair, but she ripped it free completely, ignoring the tearing fabric. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged fury as she marched toward the stage. "You told me the farm was empty!" Brittany screams at her mother, her voice tearing through the chaotic noise of the ballroom. She pointed a trembling, accusing finger directly at Patricia's face. "Where is the $200,000 I gave you for the mortgage?" I did not raise my voice to match Brittany's hysterical screech. I simply tapped the surface of my tablet. The massive screens behind the podium instantly shifted, replacing the Department of Defense contract with a highly complex, color-coded financial flowchart. The silence in the ballroom deepened into something suffocating. The wealthy investors in the front row leaned forward, their eyes tracking the aggressive red lines connecting a series of bank accounts. I looked at my sister-in-law, watching the color drain entirely from her face as she recognized the account numbers flashing on the 50-foot projection. "You forgot the fundamental rule of corporate espionage, Brittany," I stated, my voice echoing cold and clear across the room. "You never trust a co-conspirator who is actively bleeding cash. You thought you were buying a lucrative piece of commercial real estate. You drained your own son's future, stealing $200,000 from his trust fund, and wired it directly to Patricia's shell company. You expected to use my farm to build a suburban empire." I tapped the screen again. A verified wire transfer receipt appeared, displaying Brittany's exact routing information and a massive outbound transaction. But Patricia did not buy the mortgage, Brittany. I continued enunciating every syllable with forensic precision. I traced the SWIFT codes through 3 different international routing hubs. The money you stole from your child did not go to a municipal zoning board, and it certainly did not go toward buying Liam's farm. It went to a holding account registered in Macau. Patricia used your $200,000 to pay off her offshore gambling debts. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. The polite country club veneer of the afternoon completely shattered. Patricia took a staggering step backward on the stage, her hand flying to her throat. She looked utterly exposed, stripped of her elegant matriarchal armor, reduced to a desperate fraud, standing in front of the very people she relied upon for social survival. She tried to speak, waving her hands frantically at the investors in the front row, but the microphone only picked up her ragged, panicked breathing. Brittany stared at the screen, her mouth opening and closing as her mind struggled to process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. Her own mother had played her for an absolute fool. The golden child, the daughter who had spent her entire life basking in Patricia's approval and mirroring her toxic behavior, had been nothing more than a convenient disposable piggy bank. The realization hit Brittany like a physical blow. The carefully cultivated high society facade dissolved in an instant, replaced by something feral and unhinged. "You stole from me!" Brittany shrieked, her voice tearing through the ambient acoustics of the ballroom. "You swore we were partners. You swore the farm was empty." Brittany lunged forward, completely abandoning any pretense of dignity. She grabbed the edge of the mahogany podium, shoving it violently aside to get to her mother. The heavy wooden stand tipped and crashed onto the stage, the microphone releasing an agonizing screech of feedback that made half the room cover their ears. Patricia threw up her hands, backing away toward the heavy velvet curtains. "Brittany, stop it!" Patricia pleaded, her voice shrill and terrified. "Not here. People are watching us. You are making a scene." "I do not care who is watching," Brittany screamed, launching herself at Patricia. She grabbed the collar of Patricia's expensive designer jacket, shaking her violently. "Where is my money? I emptied the trust. I have nothing left. You bankrupt me for a casino." The physical altercation sent shockwaves through the crowd. The venture capitalists and real estate developers recoiled in absolute horror, watching the 2 women tear at each other on the stage. It was not the financial crime that repulsed them, but the sloppy, pathetic desperation of the betrayal. They were witnessing a family cannibalizing itself in broad daylight, and they wanted absolutely nothing to do with the blast radius. Near the front row, the political calculus of the room was shifting rapidly. Mayor Sterling stared at the projected offshore gambling receipts, his face a mask of grim realization. He had spent the last 2 years taking aggressive campaign donations from Patricia, publicly championing her development projects. Now he was standing in a room while she was exposed for federal tax evasion, interstate wire fraud, and stealing from a minor. The mayor made brief, urgent eye contact with his lead security detail. Without saying a single word, the mayor turned and walked briskly toward the rear service exit, slipping through the heavy brass doors and abandoning his greatest financial backer to the wolves. The political donors and city council members immediately followed his lead, a silent exodus of power fleeing the sinking ship. The ballroom was rapidly emptying of anyone who could have offered Patricia protection. On the stage, Patricia managed to shove Brittany backward. Brittany stumbled, her stiletto heel catching on the microphone cord, tearing the fabric of her $5,000 dress as she caught herself against the wall. Both women were panting, their hair disheveled, their expensive armor completely ruined by their own greed. I stood perfectly still in my blood-red suit, watching the empire they had built on lies collapse into dust. I did not need to raise my voice. I had already executed the hostile takeover. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed up the wooden stairs on the far side of the stage. DeAndre emerged from the shadows of the auditorium. He had discarded the generic audiovisual headset. His posture was no longer hunched or accommodating. He walked with the lethal, terrifying confidence of a man who held all the cards. He was no longer the dismissed blue-collar ex-husband they had relentlessly mocked and underestimated. He was a certified forensic investigator, and he was walking directly into his own perfectly orchestrated crime scene. Patricia and Brittany froze, staring at him in sheer confusion as he crossed the stage. He did not look at Patricia. He walked straight up to his ex-wife. DeAndre stopped inches from Brittany, his expression completely unreadable. He reached into the inside pocket of his black jacket and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. He held it out, waiting for her trembling hands to take it. Brittany stared at the sealed manila envelope in DeAndre's outstretched hand as if it were a venomous snake. Her chest heaved with panicked, shallow breaths. She snatched the thick package from his grip, her perfectly manicured nails tearing frantically at the heavy paper flap. She pulled out a thick stack of legal documents stapled together with a stiff blue backing. Her eyes darted wildly across the top page, scanning the bold black text. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking hollow and sickly under the harsh glare of the projector lights. It was a petition for dissolution of marriage. Attached directly behind it was an emergency ex parte order for sole physical and legal custody. The document was already stamped, processed, and signed by a family court judge. DeAndre did not wait for her to process the crushing reality of the paperwork. He stepped past her, walking calmly toward the overturned mahogany podium. He reached down, picked up the microphone from the floor, and tapped it once. The sharp thud echoed clearly through the ballroom speakers, commanding the absolute attention of the remaining stragglers, the country club staff, and the few paralyzed investors who had stayed to watch the wreckage. He looked down at Brittany. The subservient, quiet man she had bossed around for a decade was entirely gone. "You spent our entire marriage treating me like a failure," DeAndre said, his voice deep, resonant, and unapologetic. "You mocked my job. You told your friends I was just a blue-collar disappointment who dragged down your high society reputation. You thought I was too stupid to see what you were doing. But my skills as a forensic investigator are exactly what exposed your financial crimes." Brittany shook her head, clutching the divorce papers to her chest. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. "Patricia didn't buy the mortgage, Brittany." DeAndre spoke into the microphone, ensuring his voice filled every corner of the room, cutting through her denial. "She used your $200,000 to pay off her offshore gambling debts. You stole our son's college fund to play real estate mogul with your mother. You are broke, Brittany. You have absolutely nothing left. I am taking my son, and you will never speak to me like a second-class citizen again." The finality in his words struck Brittany like a physical blow. The absolute reality of her situation crashed down on her all at once. She had no money, no investment, no husband, and no child. Her entire identity, built on stolen wealth and an unearned sense of superiority, had evaporated in less than 5 minutes. Her knees buckled. Brittany collapsed onto the hard wooden floor of the stage, her ruined designer dress pooling around her. She dropped the legal documents and lunged forward, wrapping her arms desperately around DeAndre's legs. "Please," Brittany sobbed, her voice a wretched guttural wail that made the remaining onlookers cringe in horror. The high society princess was reduced to a groveling, broken mess, dark mascara streaking down her tear-soaked cheeks. "Don't take him. DeAndre, please don't take my baby. I will do anything. I will apologize. I will find a way to pay it back. Just do not leave me, Eve." DeAndre looked down at her. There was no pity in his eyes, only the cold, hard detachment of a man who had finally cut a toxic infection out of his life. He reached down, grabbed her wrists, and forcefully peeled her hands off his trousers. He did not say another word to her. He simply turned his back, walked down the stage steps, and took his place standing shoulder to shoulder with me. Brittany curled into a ball on the stage, weeping loudly, completely abandoning her high society facade. Patricia, who had been pressed against the heavy velvet curtains, watched her golden child completely shatter. Instead of rushing to comfort her sobbing daughter, Patricia's vicious survival instinct flared. She realized she was the only target left. Her strip mall was gone. Her offshore accounts were exposed. The mayor had already slipped out the back door to avoid the scandal. But her monumental narcissistic ego refused to allow her to surrender quietly. Patricia stomped forward, her heels clicking aggressively against the stage. She stepped right over her weeping daughter, as if Brittany were a discarded piece of trash. She pointed a trembling, accusing finger directly at me, her face contorted into an ugly, desperate snarl. "You set us up!" Patricia screamed, her voice shrill and echoing through the vast, mostly empty spaces of the ballroom. "This is a complete fabrication. You forged those bank statements. You hacked into the projectors to humiliate me. I am Patricia Wilson. I built this town. I will sue you for defamation. I will sue you for fraud. I will drag you through civil court until you do not have a single penny left to your name. I will take that encrypted data center. I will take the farm, and I will destroy you." She was unraveling, shouting empty threats to a room of empty chairs. I stood my ground, my arms crossed, watching the pathetic end of a tyrant. I did not even bother to raise my microphone to reply. She had already lost, and her screaming only cemented her guilt for the few witnesses left in the room. Before Patricia could draw breath for another hysterical threat, a new sound cut through the tense atmosphere of the ballroom. It was not the polite murmur of wealthy investors or the clinking of crystal glasses. It was a sharp, heavy, and deeply intimidating noise. From the grand marble hallway situated just outside the main double doors of the ballroom, a loud rhythmic sound echoed against the stone walls. It was the sound of heavy synchronized footsteps, not one person but a highly coordinated team moving with absolute tactical precision. The heavy thud of combat boots marching in unison grew rapidly louder, vibrating through the floorboards. The remaining country club staff froze, turning their heads toward the entrance in absolute silence. Patricia stopped mid-rant, her arms still suspended in the air, her eyes wide as she stared at the closed mahogany doors. The heavy synchronized footsteps stopped abruptly right outside the ballroom entrance. The heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom did not just open, they were shoved apart with a violent synchronized force that sent the solid brass handles slamming into the interior walls. 6 men and 2 women strode into the room. They did not wear the tailored Italian suits or designer gowns of the country club elite. They wore dark utilitarian windbreakers, each emblazoned with bright yellow block letters across the back and chest. IRSCID. The Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division had arrived. Behind them, 2 uniformed local police officers stood guard at the exit, effectively sealing the room. The remaining investors and socialites, already severely spooked by the projection screens, completely lost their composure. A genuine stampede erupted. Wealthy venture capitalists shoved past one another, abandoning their crystal champagne flutes and designer coats in a desperate scramble to distance themselves from the epicenter of the blast. Chairs were violently overturned. A tray of expensive hors d'oeuvres crashed to the floor, shattering porcelain. Men who had just been aggressively negotiating real estate deals were now physically pressing themselves against the far walls, holding their hands up in a universal gesture of surrender and absolute non-involvement. No one wanted to be standing within a 10-foot radius of Patricia Wilson when the federal government snapped the trap shut. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered woman with an incredibly stern expression, bypassed the chaos entirely. Her eyes locked directly onto Patricia, who was still frozen on the stage, her hand trembling in the air where she had just been pointing at me. I stepped forward, putting myself directly in Patricia's line of sight, forcing her to look away from the advancing agents and focus entirely on me. I let a cold, sweet smile touch my lips. It was the exact same patronizing, faux maternal smile she had given me for years at every awful Sunday dinner. "Did you know?" I asked, projecting my voice clearly over the din of the panicked ballroom, "that the IRS whistleblower program pays up to 30% of recovered funds to the informant?" Patricia's jaw dropped. Her eyes darted from my face to the federal agents rapidly climbing the stage steps. The blood rushed out of her head so fast she visibly swayed. "I am not just taking the farm, Patricia." I continued, my voice smooth and merciless. "I submitted your 7-year tax evasion audit on Tuesday. Every hidden offshore account, every inflated expense report, every laundered casino chip. It took me months to trace the shell companies, but your accounting was surprisingly sloppy. You are looking at tens of millions in federal restitution and penalties. And the United States government is going to cut me a massive check just for handing them the map." The lead agent stepped onto the stage, her silver badge prominently displayed on her belt. "Patricia Wilson, you are under arrest for tax evasion, wire fraud, and money laundering. You have the right to remain silent." The reality of the words seemed to break something physical inside Patricia's mind. The untouchable matriarch, the woman who had ruled her family and her social circle with absolute terrifying authority, completely shattered. As the second agent reached out and grabbed her wrist, twisting it firmly behind her back, Patricia screamed. It was a raw, ugly sound. She thrashed against the agent's grip, her pristine, perfectly sprayed hair tumbling into her face in a chaotic mess. Dark streaks of mascara began to run down her cheeks, mixing heavily with her tears. Her custom-tailored designer gown caught under the heel of an agent's heavy boot, tearing audibly as she was forced downward. She fell to her knees, the luxurious fabric dragging across the scuffed floorboards of the stage. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around her wrists echoed over the sound of her frantic sobbing. She looked up at me, her face contorted in absolute desperation. The arrogance was completely eradicated, replaced by the pathetic pleading of a cornered animal. "Natalie, please!" Patricia begged, her voice cracking as she strained against the agents holding her down. "You cannot do this. We are family. I am your mother-in-law. Liam would not want this. He loved me. He would never want to see his own mother treated like a criminal." Hearing her invoke my husband's name to save her own skin ignited a cold, absolute fury deep within my chest. I walked slowly across the stage, stopping just inches from where she was kneeling. I looked down at the ruined woman, taking in the smeared makeup, the torn dress, and the steel cuffs binding her hands. I crouched down, balancing perfectly in my heels. I leaned in close, closing the distance until I was mere inches from her ear, ensuring that the federal agents giving us a momentary berth could not hear what I was about to say. "You never understood your own son," I whispered, my voice a lethal quiet blade. "You thought Liam was a naive dreamer who bought a worthless farm. You thought he was weak, but he was exactly like me. He saw everything you were doing." Patricia froze, her breath hitching as her tear-filled eyes locked onto mine. "Liam locked me out of the farm." I continued the truth of my husband's final months, finally forming a perfect, unbreakable picture in my mind. "He pushed me away and hid the Department of Defense contract because he knew the federal government was already circling your accounts. He knew you were going down, and he knew you would try to drag everyone else down with you. He locked me out because he wanted to destroy you himself to protect me from the fallout." I stood back up, looking down at her one final time as the agents pulled her firmly to her feet. "I am not ruining his legacy, Patricia. I just finished my husband's work." The federal agents hauled Patricia upright with practiced, unapologetic efficiency. Her knees dragged momentarily against the polished floorboards before her expensive heels found traction. The heavy velvet curtains brushed against her torn designer gown, leaving a dusting of lint on the ruined silk. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, broken only by the sharp metallic ratcheting of the handcuffs and her ragged, wet breathing. The venture capitalists, the real estate developers, and the country club socialites, the very people whose approval she had craved, bought and manipulated for decades, parted like the Red Sea. They did not look at her with pity or concern. They looked at her with pure, unadulterated contempt. She was a liability, a contagion. Men and women who had eagerly drunk her champagne only an hour ago now physically pressed their backs against the walls, averting their eyes, silently praying the federal agents would not ask them any questions. As she was marched down the center aisle, Patricia kept her head bowed, her meticulously constructed empire reduced to the cold steel binding her wrists. The heavy brass doors swallowed her, cutting off her final pathetic sob as she was shoved into the marble hallway. On the stage, Brittany remained crumpled. She clawed at the wood, her fingers curling into empty fists. No one rushed to her side. The catering staff, expertly pretending nothing was amiss, continued to clean up the spilled drinks and shattered porcelain. The remaining investors snapped their briefcases shut and briskly exited, entirely ignoring the weeping woman in the center of the room. Brittany was financially annihilated, stripped of her child, abandoned by her husband, and orphaned by her mother's monumental greed. She looked up, her tear-streaked face searching the room for a single sympathetic expression, but the elite crowd had already erased her from their social registry. Without her trust fund and her mother's terrifying influence, Brittany was a ghost haunting a life she could no longer afford. I did not spare her a second glance. I turned my back on the stage and descended the stairs, my heels clicking with measured, calm steps. At the base of the stairs, Mr. Caldwell stood waiting in the shadows of the exit. The elderly estate lawyer held 2 crystal flutes of champagne. The chaos of the federal raid had not ruffled his tailored 3-piece suit in the slightest. He extended one of the flutes toward me. His eyes, usually sharp and guarded, held a profound, quiet warmth. I took the glass, feeling the cool condensation against my fingertips. He raised his own in a silent, respectful toast. "Liam always said you were the smartest person in any room." Mr. Caldwell stated, his voice a steady, comforting anchor in the cavernous, emptying ballroom. He was right. I felt a sudden sharp tightness in my throat. I tapped my rim against his. The clear crystal rang with a pure, resonant tone. "He gave me the tools," I replied, taking a slow sip. "He took all the incoming fire, so I would have the time to figure out how to assemble them. He knew exactly what his mother was doing, and he knew how ruthless she would be if she realized we had the Department of Defense server farm." Mr. Caldwell smiled, a genuine expression of pride that smoothed the wrinkles around his eyes. "He knew you would piece the puzzle together. He trusted your brilliant mind more than he trusted his own life. The estate is officially clear, Natalie. The federal holds are strictly on Patricia's assets, the farm, the encrypted servers, the patents. They are unconditionally yours." I handed the half-empty glass back to him. I pushed through the heavy brass doors, leaving the stifling, perfume-choked air of the country club behind. The crisp afternoon air hit my face, smelling of pine trees and absolute freedom. The parking lot was nearly empty, the luxury cars having fled the scandal like rats off a sinking ship. I walked to my sensible, mud-splattered truck, parked defiantly between 2 vacant spots that had previously held the mayor's town car and Patricia's Mercedes. I unlocked the cab and pulled out a thick, leather-bound portfolio. I laid it flat across the warm metal hood of the truck, the sunlight glaring off the pristine white pages. Flipping to the final page, the Department of Defense renewal agreement stared back at me. $40 million. 10 years of guaranteed federal security and massive infrastructure expansion. I clicked my pen, leaned over the hood of the truck, and signed my name on the dotted line. The ink flowed smooth and black. The battle was completely over. The war was definitively won. The harsh winter eventually thawed into a brilliant, blooming spring. Several months passed. The toxic wreckage of the Wilson family faded into the background of my life, buried under federal indictments, asset seizures, and lengthy bankruptcy filings. Patricia was awaiting trial in a federal holding facility. Brittany had vanished from the city entirely. I shifted my truck into gear, turning off the main highway onto the familiar dirt road. The tires crunched against freshly laid, evenly graded gravel. I rolled down the windows, letting the warm, fragrant breeze sweep through the cab. The dense tree line gave way to open pasture. As I rounded the final bend, I pressed the brakes and shifted into park. I stared through the windshield, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. The property was completely unrecognizable. I drove up to the farm, but it was no longer a decaying barn. Instead of sagging timber and rusted corrugated metal, a sleek fortress of modern engineering rose against the evergreen tree line. The original footprint of the property had been entirely excavated, expanded, and reinforced. Walls of tinted ballistic glass and matte black steel panels reflected the bright morning sunlight. A 12-foot perimeter fence equipped with high-definition surveillance and 24-hour armed security patrols surrounded the acreage. I rolled down the window of my truck and pressed my thumb against the biometric reader at the main security checkpoint. The heavy steel barricade glided open flawlessly and in total silence. Beside the gate rested a massive, polished obsidian monolith. Engraved deep into the black stone in sharp silver lettering was the name that started it all: Liam's Ridge Data Solutions. I drove up the freshly paved sweeping driveway and parked in my designated spot, near the private executive entrance. The transformation of this land was the ultimate manifestation of my husband's final wish. Beneath the manicured lawns and the sleek exterior architecture rested a subterranean climate-controlled bunker housing rows upon rows of encrypted high-density servers. We were officially managing the secure data logistics for the Regional Department of Defense sector. The hostile takeover was complete, and the rewards were astronomical. As I walked through the sliding glass doors and stepped into the pristine temperature-regulated lobby, my thoughts drifted briefly to the women who had tried to bury me. The federal justice system did not care about country club memberships, mayoral connections, or high society pedigrees. Patricia Wilson was currently serving an 85-month sentence at a minimum security federal correctional institution. The woman who had once commanded ballrooms and terrorized local zoning boards was now reduced to an 8-digit inmate number. She no longer wore custom-tailored silk gowns or diamonds. She wore standard-issue khaki scrubs. Her perfectly manicured hands were now raw and calloused from her mandatory daily shifts, working in the facility's commercial laundry room. Stripped entirely of her wealth, her influence, and her terrifying authority, Patricia was just another anonymous fraud serving time. Her letters pleading for financial assistance from her former socialite friends went entirely unanswered. Brittany was faring no better out in the civilian world. The emergency custody order had held firm in family court. With her trust fund completely drained to pay off Patricia's offshore gambling debts and her reputation entirely radioactive, Brittany had been forced to face the brutal reality of the working class she had mocked her entire life. She was currently employed at a discount fast fashion retail outlet in a rundown strip mall 2 towns over. The woman who used to throw $5,000 temper tantrums over scuffed designer shoes now spent 8 hours a day on her feet, wearing a cheap polyester uniform vest, scanning barcodes, and organizing clearance racks. She took orders from a 22-year-old shift manager and endured the daily rudeness of bargain shoppers. She lived in a cramped, dark studio apartment entirely cut off from the luxury she believed was her birthright. Her toxic entitlement had yielded zero dividends when the money evaporated. I stepped into the private elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. The doors parted quietly, revealing my executive suite. It was a sprawling, state-of-the-art office featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an unobstructed, breathtaking view of the valley below. I set my leather portfolio down on the massive glass desk and took a seat in my ergonomic chair. I had barely opened my laptop when the heavy oak door to my office swung open. DeAndre walked in looking like an entirely different man. The hunched posture and the defeated aura he carried during his marriage to Brittany were completely eradicated. He stood tall, broad-shouldered, and immaculately dressed in a sharp charcoal suit. Holding his left hand was his young son, who was gripping a brightly colored toy truck and beaming with happiness. DeAndre was no longer a dismissed, underpaid audiovisual technician. With his forensic expertise and his crucial role in exposing Patricia's financial laundering, I had immediately brought him on board. He was now the lead architectural engineer and security consultant for our company's regional expansion. "Morning, boss," DeAndre said, his voice rich with genuine confidence. He walked over and dropped a thick roll of fresh blueprints onto the edge of my desk. "I just finished the structural plans for the new server wing on the east acreage. The cooling systems are fully optimized, and the secondary biometric fail-safes meet every single Department of Defense requirement. We are ready to break ground by next Tuesday." "Excellent work, DeAndre," I replied, pulling the blueprints toward me. I looked at his son, who gave me a shy missing tooth wave. "Dropping him off at the on-site daycare." "Yeah," DeAndre smiled, looking down at his boy with absolute devotion. "He loves the new playground here, and I love knowing exactly where he is safe and secure while I work." DeAndre and I shared a brief, knowing look. It was the silent mutual respect of two survivors. We had both been dragged into the Wilson family's venomous orbit. We had both been underestimated, mocked, and designated as disposable collateral damage. Instead of breaking, we had banded together, shattered their corrupt empire, and walked away with the ultimate victory. "I will review these specs before lunch," I told him. "Have a good morning, DeAndre." "You too, Natalie." He turned and walked out, his son chattering happily beside him as the heavy oak door clicked shut. I sat back in my chair. The quiet, powerful hum of the massive servers beneath my feet felt like a steady heartbeat pulsing through the building. I reached out and picked up a framed photograph resting on the corner of my desk. It was a picture of Liam. He was wearing his faded denim jacket, standing in front of the old sagging barn, smiling a bright, genuine smile. I traced the edge of the silver frame with my thumb. He had seen the decay in his family long before I did. He had played the fool to protect me, setting the board perfectly, so that when the time came, I would have everything I needed to win. I picked up my ceramic mug, the steam rising from the dark, rich coffee, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I looked out the massive windows at the sprawling, multi-million-dollar empire surrounding me. I did not just survive Patricia and Brittany's toxic arrogance. I weaponized their greed, used their own blinding entitlement against them, and built an impenetrable fortress out of the wreckage. I set the coffee mug down, my eyes lingering on Liam's smiling face. I smiled back. It was a genuine, triumphant, and entirely peaceful smile. The war was over and the future belonged entirely to me. The dramatic conclusion of the Wilson family saga offers a profound exploration of a universal truth: empires built on deception, entitlement, and the underestimation of others will inevitably collapse under their own weight. Patricia and Brittany operated under the dangerous assumption that their wealth and social standing made them untouchable. They believed that manipulating those around them, whether it was draining a child's trust fund or dismissing a spouse as a blue-collar failure, was simply the cost of doing business in their elite circle. Their fatal flaw was not just their greed, but their blinding arrogance. They failed to recognize the quiet competence and growing strength of the people they sought to oppress. Natalie's strategic dismantling of her mother-in-law's fraudulent empire serves as a masterclass in patience and precision. She did not react to Patricia's constant belittling with emotional outbursts. Instead, she observed gathered evidence and waited for the perfect moment to strike. Her victory was not born from malice, but from a calculated pursuit of justice for her late husband Liam, who had also recognized the rot within his own family. Natalie understood that the most effective way to neutralize a narcissist is to expose their reality to the very audience they are desperately trying to impress. By revealing Patricia's offshore gambling debts and tax evasion to the venture capitalists and the mayor, Natalie stripped away the only armor Patricia had left, which was her social capital. Furthermore, DeAndre's transformation from a mocked, subservient husband into the forensic investigator who catalyzed his own wife's downfall highlights the danger of reducing people to superficial labels. Brittany saw only a man who did not fit her high society aesthetic, completely ignoring his intellect and capabilities. When DeAndre presented the divorce papers, and the undeniable proof of her financial crimes, he reclaimed his dignity in the most absolute way possible. He proved that true power does not reside in designer clothes or country club memberships, but in truth, competence, and self-respect. The stark contrast between the fallout for the perpetrators and the resolution for the survivors is the story's ultimate lesson. Patricia and Brittany are left with nothing, their identities shattered, along with their bank accounts. Conversely, Natalie and DeAndre, the characters who relied on their skills and integrity, emerge victorious. Natalie does not just inherit a decaying farm. She transforms it into a highly secure, lucrative corporate facility, honoring Liam's legacy while securing her own future. She weaponized their toxicity to build something enduring. This narrative reminds us that while manipulation and deceit may offer temporary gains, they require a constant, exhausting performance that is always one misstep away from ruin. True security and lasting success are built on a foundation of authenticity, hard work, and respect for those around us. When we underestimate others and prioritize greed over human connection, we are merely setting the stage for our own spectacular downfall. What is a time in your life when you saw the truth finally catch up with someone who thought they were untouchable? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every